Dr. Mayer with his third video in the series looking at research literature in the world of exercise, sports science, nutrition science. I'm hoping you find the other two videos valuable, and this one will be valuable as well. Kind of pulling some of the concepts in from the other two and looking at the not making the mistake of going with the author's conclusion in a study based on a global statistical method. And I'll explain what that is. That may not sound very interesting, but if you'll hang with me in this video, I think you'll glean some information where you won't just discard research or hold on to research and not have read the study properly or read it closely. And sometimes we discard a study and have discarded something very interesting that was going on in that study just because statistical significance wasn't reached. Conversely, we could say, oh, this is it. This doesn't matter, or it does matter. But when we read the study, it's like, well, the participants weren't who I thought they were. And the while statistically significant, so on and so forth. Okay. So first of all, before we get started, subscribe to my channel if you'd like to hear more cool stuff in exercise sports science, including these talks on research. There's a lot of other videos I've made as well in different areas. I'll be making more as the days go on. Be sure to like this video if you like it as well. And of course, if you have a comment, leave it below. All right, so let's get into this. So I have a study in front of me that I'm not going to read the authors because my goal isn't to pick apart research authors. I've done research. I am not a prolific researcher. I am doing research, okay? Nothing on the scale of some of these magnificent researchers you see that are producing research all the time. But what I do know and have done enough research to realize is difficult. Research is hard. So the goal is not to be critical. The goal is just to, in this video series is help you critically think about the information that's in these studies. So let's look at this study. This was an 8-week study that was done comparing cluster set training versus traditional set training. So this was done with the bench press in what were called strength trained individuals. Okay, so we have a lot of data already kind of sift through. And what the outcome of the study was looking at barbell velocity in particular, but just these different markers of power. So barbell power, and then absolute versus relative power, and then the actual barbell velocity itself, both in peak and in mean. And so looking at those variables over a spectrum of loading, so 45 all the way up to 95%. Okay, so do the 45 to 95%, looking at barbell velocity, looking at power on the bench press. Week 1, do it 8 weeks later after using the cluster or the traditional method. The cluster was do a rep, rest for 30 seconds, do a rep, rest for 30 seconds, and then rest for 3 minutes. So that's a cluster set. Okay. The idea is that doing cluster sets will have a better outcome in terms of power because you maintain the quality of movement throughout the set, as opposed to doing a straight set, which you can get fatigued towards the end. The barbell velocity starts to decline. And so this is one of the few studies I've seen so far that have looked at cluster sets in a training situation, which I think is fantastic. We have to keep in mind, though, this is the bench press. So the bench versus the squat, and the model was the bench. I think the bench is irrelevant. Like many times, it's just easy to do because it's less technical than a squat. It's still technical, okay? But does this infer to larger muscle mass exercises like the squat or the deadlift? I don't know. We don't know that, so we have to be careful with overgeneralizing there. When we look at the participants closely, they use a submaximal way of determining if these individuals were strength trained, and men and women are lumped together, and one of the sexes was considered fair and the other one was considered poor. So I wouldn't call them strength trained. I'd call them not untrained, right? And so we have to look at the spectrum of training here and say, okay, they're not untrained, but they're not strength trained either. Because our definitions could differ between what is strength training and what's not. So if these individuals trained for a year and did the same study, we might have a different outcome, okay? And so 8 weeks later, looked at the spectrum. We have to keep that in mind. These participants probably more towards the untrained side. So when that happens, anything works. So using an advanced training method like cluster sets, you may not get any difference because anything works. So doing something advanced is not going to gain you that much. And when you look at the actual data, then we might see that. So overall, there was no significant difference between groups at all these different percentages, okay? The only kind of difference between the two on the surface when it comes to just looking at significance was at the lower percentages, 45, 55, the time, from pre to post was significant in the cluster group where it wasn't for the traditional, okay? So there was some inklings there like something's going on. So in other words, the lower the load, the better the outcome was. So in other words, people are moving the bar faster. Later, after the 8 weeks, they're moving the bar faster as a result of being cluster set versus the traditional. Although, when compared, there was no significant difference, okay? So this is where you have to use your eyes. Now, we can argue about whether that's meaningful or not, and that's okay. we have to draw a line in the sand to say there's significance or not. The authors were correct. That's correct to do. But if you don't read this study, you would just say, oh, cluster sets don't matter for strength trained individuals. Well, that's not correct. As you start to read it, you start to see that that's not true. The authors didn't make any mistakes in the way they concluded, but it's on you as the reader, though, to go in there and start to see the trend. So if you look at just look at the figures that provided, keeping the y-axis in mind, that, just because there's a big block on one side and not on the other doesn't mean that there's anything useful, because you can have, the increments on the y-axis, in other words, matter. But when you look at the study, especially when it comes to the area of peak velocity, you'll notice that cluster has benefit over the traditional at these different percentages of loading. Okay, and so what that means is that the statistical analyses may not have been sensitive enough to pick up these changes, and the participant pool may not have been big enough. Over time, I would suspect, and I could be wrong, it could go the other way, that over time the peak velocity will improve from the cluster set training in the trained individual as these people become trained, and it'll separate even more from the traditional. That would be my hypothesis. I could be wrong. It could go the other way, or nothing could happen. I don't know. But we have this snapshot in time. I'm making inferences based on what the literature I've seen already looks like, and that would be my wager, is that the more trained you are, the more cluster sets make a difference. Just like with post-activation performance enhancement, right? The more trained you are, the more of an effect you get. So to say it doesn't work isn't correct. To say it depends, it's a tool, use it with the right people, that's more pertinent. And the same, I believe, applies to this study. As you wade through the table, that there's effect sizes. You'll see the effect sizes were large, moderate to large in the traditional, and lesser in magnitude, in the cluster, and lesser in magnitude as versus the traditional, except for the 95% level, the highest percentages, or highest percentage that were analyzed. So again, you'd have to read this to see this data. And again, we could argue what we think is meaningful, what isn't, but I think anybody who looked at this would say, okay, on the surface, yes, there's no significance, but there's something going on here that is of interest. Now, spoiler alert, I do like cluster sets, so I'm probably biased, and that's why I picked up the study as an example. I'm not as concerned about this study. I'm just saying, when we analyze research, you have to read beyond the statistics in the study. That doesn't mean that you hang your hat on the things that you interpret, but you can absorb the information yourself and start to look at other research then and say, I noticed that from the other study that didn't reach significance, but I started to see this trend. And then you see the next study on this, and these are better trained individuals in the back squat, and you notice there is a separation that's occurring in the research literature. Significance is being reached, right? You're starting to see this trend. Okay, and then you can decide as a practitioner if this is something you want to employ or not. But you didn't just say, oh, I read the abstract, it wasn't significance, cluster sets don't matter. There's a lot of holes in this study, as there is in any study, that would say that isn't completely true. Okay, and truth is a hard word in science, literature anyway. And the reason that is because there's so many variables that can occur, from the training stats, like I mentioned before, to the type of protocol that was used, to the outcome measures that were utilized, all these different things. The word supported or unsupported, or accumulation of evidence, or those type of things are better ways to talk about this. So this particular piece of evidence would say that cluster sets is not supported in strength trained individuals in the bench press, and I would say maybe. Right? Maybe. I want to see more. And in fact, when I look at this study, it compels me to use cluster sets more so in trained individuals, perhaps. That's my interpretation. That may not be yours, and that's okay. And we could discuss that. But if we just throw the study out, or just hang our hat on just the global results, we would be making a mistake. Okay? And I've made that mistake before. It's not like I'm above this. That's why I'm talking about these topics in videos. If anything, I'm teaching you not to do these things these mistakes that I've made, right? And so you digest the research literature properly, or at least better properly. By whose standard? Better than maybe you are now. So again, if you found this video valuable, like it, leave a comment. If you don't agree with me, made you mad, I don't know why I would, but if it did, leave a comment. I'll respond to you, and I'll see you in the next video.